Hello, I'm Robert Perkins, and this is the third in our series of virtual Bible study lessons from the book of Colossians. Now, continuing the applicational part of chapter 3, Paul is going to talk about a different relationship now, and that is the relationship between slaves and masters. You may be thinking, now I can tune out on this one because I'm neither a slave nor a master. Well, that is true. We no longer have in this country, and haven't for almost 200 years, a relationship known as slavery or the institution of slavery. But the principles that Paul uses here can just as well carry over into the employer-employee relationship, which most of us are either in right now or have been in the past. And so we'll look and try to apply these principles in the same way that they are discussed regarding slaves and masters. This is beginning in chapter 3, verse 22. Slaves, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality. Masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. All right, as I said, this is not directly applicable to any of us because none of us are slaves or masters. But if we will consider this in the atmosphere of an employer and an employee, I think it will be helpful for us to see the attitude that is described here as Paul applies this. He says, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters on earth. So that would say to employees, be obedient to your employer here on earth, not with external service, as those who merely please men. I could use a rather uncouth term here, but I'm not going to do it. But I think each of you probably understands what he's talking about here when he says, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. So we're to be sincere, upfront, and transparent in the way that we conduct ourselves in regard to the situation where we have a boss or an owner or someone that we have to report to as the employee. Fearing the Lord with sincerity of heart. Then he says, whatever you do your work heartily. There's a quote from the Old Testament that I memorized as a child, and it says, whatsoever your hand findeth to do it with your might. So Paul is reinforcing that statement from the Old Testament when he says, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men. And then he gives the reason why we should do that, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. So our inheritance, our blessings, our rewards, if you want to think of them, that we were laying up, the treasures we are laying up in heaven are based on things that we do here on earth. And the Lord is the one who will bestow us with our inheritance, our blessings and rewards and so forth. And we need to be sure that we remember that, understand it, and it is from him that we receive these rewards. And then he sums it all up with his fantastic statement, very short but straight to the point. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. So even though you may be working for General Motors or Kroger's or Walgreens Pharmacy, whoever your boss is, you are serving the Lord Christ by what you do there. You are modeling, in effect, the Lord Jesus himself when you are at work and doing the job that you've been hired and are being compensated to perform. So we need to look at it in that everything we are due, that we are to remember that we are serving the Lord Christ. He is ultimately our boss, if you want to think of it that way. Then Paul goes on to say, for he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done. So he's saying you're accountable to your boss. If you do something wrong, you're going to have to suffer the consequences of that. And he says that without partiality. Now here he's probably talking about the Lord again, because as you know, and perhaps your experience would tell you this, bosses can be partial. But with the Lord Christ, there is no partiality. So we need to keep that in mind. And then finally, he says, masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. Now he stopped talking about to the employee, if you will, and now he's talking to the employer. And he says to them, grant to your slaves, your employees, justice and fairness. You are to be just and fair in your dealings with your employees. That's not an option. That's an instruction, a commandment, if you will. And the reason you should do that is because of this, knowing that you too, even as the boss or maybe even the owner of the company, you too have a master in heaven. And of course, that master is the Lord Jesus Christ, and he is the one ultimately to whom all of us will be accountable. Let's attempt to summarize now what we have gone through in this lesson today. The summary statement would be, Jesus Christ is to be Lord of every aspect of our lives. In the home, husbands are to love their wives. Wives are to be in submission to their husbands. Children are to obey their parents. And in the marketplace, we are to, if we are employees, we should do our work heartily as to the Lord. If we are the employer, we should treat our employees with fairness and justice and respect. This pleases the Lord. So those statements are the summary of what we should have gotten from this lesson this very day. Let's apply those in our lives.